You are in the right place. Thank you for joining our 5:30 meeting tonight. This is the second of 2 meetings this week for the City of Sacramento, revisions to vehicle and bicycle parking requirements. Again, this is our second community meeting. We had one yesterday morning. Again, I'm going to take it a little bit slow through these first couple of slides here, but on this next slide, you're going to see that I know that we've all been in Zoom meetings for quite a long time. But it's always great to do a little bit of a reminder of, how to use Zoom, how to access what we're doing in here. So the first thing to know is that this meeting is being recorded. We want to have the recordings on the website in the next few days for anyone who has missed it. We've had a lot of interest in these meetings, and so we want to make sure that anyone who wants to see them can. So this meeting is being recorded. We'll have a meeting recording as well as the meeting summary and feedback, again, all on the website here in the next couple of weeks. The chat box is going to be remained open. You've been muted upon entry. That is to help us get through the presentation. We've left about a half hour for question and answers at the end. So we'll have plenty of time to get through the chat box, open it up, take in your questions. But again, we really just thank you for coming to our meeting here tonight. So on this next slide here, I'm going to go through a little bit of the agenda. So again, I'm going to give a little bit of the introductions, introduce you to our project team. We're going to do a little Zoom poll and understand where you guys are coming from here in Sacramento. We're going to introduce the team, have them come up with some of our project recommendations. As I mentioned, we'll have plenty of time at the end for some question and answers. We'll leave you with some next steps, the contact information for not only where the draft plan is, but also the staff members that you can have continued conversations with. But again, we're excited to get started here tonight. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the team. We have a good extensive team that is working on this project here. So with the City of Sacramento, we've got the Community Development Department, Public Works Department. As part of the consultant team, we have W-Trans, Nelson Nygaard, AIM, Strategic Economics. But I do want to assign a little bit of names to some of these companies, just so you know who you might be hearing from tonight. So again, my name is Katie DeMeo. I'm representing AIM Consulting. We're the engagement lead on the project. With the City of Sacramento, you might be hearing tonight from Vic Randall, one of our senior planners, Ryan Dodge, an associate planner, or Stacy Hulvermail, our parking manager with Public Works. With W-Trans, we have Brian Canapia joining us tonight and Nathan Sheriffin. And so with that, I'm going to move to the next slide. And so usually if you guys are at any of our public meetings, we have you sign in with where you guys live. And so with that, I'm just going to launch our first poll here that just asks you, where are you coming from here in Sacramento? Are you in the central city, East Sacramento, Land Park, Pocket, South Sacramento, Elmhurst, Oak Park, Tahoe Park, Northgate? If you don't see it, put it in the chat. We'd love to know where you guys are coming from. So again, I'm just going to leave this open. Ooh, 85% already have responded. Thanks for quick responses. 90. All right, let me just share the results. Looks like we got 63% joining us from the central city here tonight, which is great and fantastic. 5% from both South Sacramento and Land Park. A good 11% representing Oak Park and Tahoe Park. Another 5% in Natomas and North Sacramento. And we have people in the chat from College Glen and South Sacramento as well. And so again, thank you so much for using my poll. And with that, I will turn the program over to Vic with the city.
All right, thank you, Katie. So I just want to share a little background on the city policy direction that's led us here tonight. So work on the parking strategy began prior to the adoption of the 2040 General Plan and Climate Action and Adaptation Plan this past February. Initially, the project was scoped to consider parking minimums. However, the removal of minimum parking requirements was adopted as general plan policy and therefore has taken effect as of late March 2024. So the parking strategy that we're sharing with you today is really rooted in policy direction included in the city's housing element to explore instituting parking maximums along established transit corridors. The Climate Action and Adaptation Plan also includes policy direction to develop parking maximums and require parking management based on available transportation options and land use. And the 2040 General Plan includes a wide range of related policy recommendations. Key among them including managing parking supply to align with objectives for reducing vehicle miles traveled, improving air quality, supporting economic vitality, and fostering a high quality of life throughout the city. The general plan also calls for the continued deployment of a parking management strategy that optimizes the use of the existing parking supply, minimizes the need for construction of new parking facilities, and promotes shifting trips from single occupancy vehicles to biking, walking, public transit, and high occupancy vehicles. If you could go ahead and shift to the next slide, please. And so the city has made the public review draft parking strategy available for public comment directly in the document via the online community workshop, which can be accessed through the website listed here. The webpage link will also be shared in the chat. Please note that comments can be submitted by email through City Council consideration in early 2025, but the city will close the online community workshop on December 2nd. Staff will then evaluate comments received by that point in time to guide revisions for the final draft parking strategy, which again will be brought forward for commission and council approval in early 2025. And you can go to the next slide. I think I pass it on to Brian Canepa now.
Hello, everyone. Brian Canepa from W-Trans. I know everyone has
Sorry,
a hard time
Brian.
with my last name. It's okay. It's okay. Happy to be here this evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Vic and Katie, for the intro. So as Vic said, our project is really being driven by city policy and some robust documents that have been created. But our work, I just wanted to kind of kick it off and say it's also partially informed by, and at least inform people about state regulations as well. So I'm not sure if Vic mentioned this in his kind of recap there, but the direction from the general plan is to examine parking maximums, but the city has already earlier this year eliminated all minimum parking requirements in the citywide. So that's already occurred. The state passed this law, AB 2097, that took effect last year, which essentially eliminated minimum parking requirements around major transit stops throughout the state. So this map here shows essentially all the blue areas are where minimum parking requirements haven't been in effect since early 2023. Encompasses almost half the city. As well, and this will come up again later in the conversation, AB 2097 as a provision actually allows local governments to mandate that developments that provide parking in these areas, the city can by right mandate that that parking either be priced, have car share vehicles, or be publicly accessible some or all the time. So again, those are just some things to consider. So what's this project about? So this is really about thinking through a few key things. One is about vehicle parking requirements, keeping in mind that minimums have already been eliminated. That's not even part of this project anymore. Looking at maximum requirements. Looking at bike parking requirements, there already are bicycle parking requirements throughout the city, minimum bicycle parking requirements, and we were tasked with looking at those to see if they are essentially up to modern standards and best practice. And also looking at what we call the parking management toolkit. So essentially how parking services, who's very capable, Stacy's right here, handles the parking supply throughout the city, particularly in the central city. And so ultimately, we're here to gather your input on these recommendations. I do want to make a note that I saw some news stories earlier today about our presentation from yesterday. And I just want to be clear about what this project is not about, because I know there can be sometimes some confusion about it. This is not a complete streets plan. This is not a safety plan. So there have been questions that have come up from folks asking, can you stripe a bike lane? Can you do things of that? That's not what this project is about. If you think about it in terms of scale, this is a very macro level project looking at policy and regulations for the city. So it does not get into parking operations for a specific district. And it's also not intended, for example, to take any parking away. So this is, contrary to what we heard some comments about, is there parking taking away? No, that's not part of this at all. This is really looking at future development, as well as the parking management, how the city manages its parking. So the schedule and how we've kind of gotten to where we are right now. So we kicked off this project over a year ago, and we've been meeting with several groups to discuss ideas for the project. We have an internal working group. We've had a couple community conversations last winter. As you can see by the bubble here, we are now in our next round of community meetings. Once we get input from everyone, Especially, I would encourage everyone to go on Conveo and put your written comments in the document. We're having these workshops here so we can talk through the process with you, answer questions, but at the end of the day, we really, really want to see your written comments if you have the time and availability. With those written comments in mind, we will create a final draft of the parking report for adoption in early 2025. So I'll dive in. As I said, there's kind of three components to this plan: vehicle code reforms, bicycle code reforms, and the parking management toolkit. Starting out with the vehicle parking reforms, I'll kind of reiterate again that these are all very much driven by city policy, as kind of what Vic laid out in terms of the emphasis on sustainability, affordability, and so forth. Second, the process, we try to make it as data-driven as possible. So you can see some of the kind of rudimentary graphics that we hear of on the screen, looking at vehicle ownership by geography within the city, looking at vehicle ownership by income level within the city for concerns about equity concerns. And we also know, for example, we actually worked with the city, and they were really good to provide us with this, provided us development data on every approved project in the city within the past 5 years, going back to 2019, so that we had a firm understanding of every single project that's out there throughout the city, how much parking was actually approved for each project. And I mean parking in terms of both vehicle parking as well as bicycle parking. So it really gave us a good handle on what the market actually wants to provide, or if the market at the time was simply providing what the minimum requirements were. And so we were able to use that data to help inform our recommendations. So what are the recommendations? So currently right now, the city is actually broken up into various kind of zones for parking. And as Vic mentioned, the city direction from the general plan was to establish maximum parking requirements, or essentially a limit on the amount of parking that new development can provide, only in transit corridors or near transit stops and within the central city. And so we took a fresh look at the transit districts that exist currently, and we said, okay, for the purposes of maximum parking requirements, we're following the general plan guidance and only having it with a half-mile transit stops in the central city. And those are essentially the two zones that you see here on this map. The dark red represents the central city, and the orangish red kind of blobs are essentially half-mile walking sheds from high-frequency transit stops. And so the idea is that maximum parking requirements would only be effective in these areas. Minimum parking requirements are still gone citywide. That's already a done deal. The city already did that months ago. But these are the two districts that would take effect for maximum requirements. And so the data that the city supplied to us in terms of the development data specifically came from these areas so that we could actually inform this. And I will say that the transit stops here are mostly light rail, although there actually are two bus lines, two RT bus lines that classify as high frequency transit stops. And so those are here as well. So the maximums themselves and what they are. So as you can see, we have the different zones here: central city, half-mile walk of existing high frequency transit, and then the rest of the city. I should note first out that the city already has maximum parking requirements. A lot of people might not already know that, but in the central business district, there already are maximum parking requirements of 1 per unit, for example, for residential. These rest of city numbers showing maximums for office and warehouse and manufacturing, these are already exist in the code. And so things like this, we're actually just carrying forward from the existing code. Otherwise, though, we have established maximums for both residential and retail offices, consolidating many of the uses that are currently in the code. This is really best practice. Right now, most codes across the city are taking these laundry lists of uses and really condensing them down because the parking demand between uses is very similar. So for example, you can see this would establish maximums of 1 per unit within the central city, 1.5 outside the central city within these half-mile TODs, and the rest of the city, there would be no maximums. And again, I'll emphasize too, that all of these numbers were combed over thoroughly through mountains of development data. And we actually banked on developing maximums that were very conservative. so that I would say the vast majority of developments that have been built in the past would continue to be built under these maximums anyways. They provide the parking, actually less parking than this. Only a few developments would actually be affected by this. And this is largely being driven by the fact that Sacramento is a pro-housing community. And there was a real feeling that they didn't want to push the envelope too much on maximums to still encourage housing production. Not to say that these can't be revisited in the future one way or another, but for the moment, we want to start with a conservative approach. Even though there are maximums proposed to be in place, the desire would to have some flexibility built in. So if there are cases where a developer would like to build more parking than the maximum, that there is a way to do that. And so the thinking here is that the maximums can be exceeded if there is a community benefit provided. So in this case, a developer could exceed the maximum automatically, essentially, by up to 25% by making those spaces publicly accessible. So you're kind of giving back in a way. An additional 25% could be exceeded if it goes through a discretionary review process with the city, if there's some special reason that could happen. So that means, for example, if you built 100 residential units in the central city, you actually can automatically build 125. But those 25 would have to be publicly accessible during summer all hours, and you could conceivably go up to 150. Next one, it has to do with unbundled parking. So just for everyone's knowledge here about what unbundled parking means, it means essentially separating the cost of parking from the leasing or ownership of, generally speaking, a residential unit. So what some places tend to do is you rent an apartment and it costs $2,000, and that $2,000 includes the parking space, whether you have a car or not. And what unbundled parking does is essentially say, well, if you were going to pay $100 for that parking space, now you have to pay $1,900 for your rent and $100 for the parking space. This is actually has been mandated by state law now. AB 1317 is going to be taking effect, which mandates unbundled parking pricing for all residential rental units of 16 or more in the state. This just takes it a step further to require for essentially all multi-unit development, and that the parking within those multi-unit developments not be reserved. Because the idea here is you want to really maximize the efficiency of that parking supply. And the idea behind unbundling is really to give people the option. You can still buy a parking space at the exact same cost that you had it before, but it doesn't compel you to buy one if you don't have one or more vehicles. And so oftentimes what you find is that it's a cost savings for folks, and it also leads to generally lower vehicle ownership rates. There's actually substantive data to show that as well. I will note, though, that due to state law, unbundling cannot be applied to affordable housing, and it's not applicable to tenants with federal housing choice vouchers. So these are a couple caveats that come along with it. The fourth strategy has to do with shared parking. And this is what I discussed a little bit earlier with AB 2097. So AB 2097 already gives cities the authority to mandate that any parking provided within these half-mile major transit stop areas be publicly accessible. What this strategy is essentially saying is that that principle would be applied citywide. Now, on talking with the city and talking with parking services, I think the intent would be that this sort of lever would be used very sparingly, only in extreme cases where you had someone who came in and provided so much parking that the city felt that it was a detriment in some way. And that there would be ample supply to be able to share with other uses. So something that kind of mirrors a bit what AB 2097 does, but it's a bit broader. Next strategy has to do with EVs and electric vehicles and disabled or accessible parking spaces. So more or less making sure that the city is and will continue to be for electric vehicles in compliance with Cal Green building standards. And with the accessible parking spaces or disabled parking, making sure that, again, off-street parking space requirements are applied to, which as is currently, but also that the city will be in compliance with what we call the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, or PROWAG. PROWAG is a set of guidelines that does many things. It's yet to be formally adopted by the Department of Transportation, but it is anticipated to do so in 2025. One of the things that comes within the PROWAG, the guidelines, is mandating, similar to off-street parking spaces, that on-street parking spaces also be required to have a certain number of accessible or disabled spaces on each block. And one of the recommendations in the plan currently is that the city explore requiring developers to pay a share for the cost of installing those disabled or accessible spaces. And so that could take different forms. It could be something that the city automatically requires of any development that comes in. The city could only require it if a building comes in and doesn't provide any off-street parking. So there's varying degrees of it, and we'd absolutely welcome public feedback on this in the Conveo report. So moving along from vehicles to bicycles, so 4 wheels to 2 wheels. So as I mentioned earlier, the city already has pretty robust bicycle parking requirements for new development. And again, I'm going to switch the subject here. We're going from maximum vehicle parking requirements to minimum bicycle parking requirements. And the city already has bicycle parking requirements for what we call long-term and short-term bicycle parking. Long-term parking being bike lockers, more secure facilities designed for people like employees or residents. Short-term bike parking being for patrons or visitors, like a bike rack out front of a shop. And so although the city already has very solid standards in place, there are improvements that can be made. Right now there are some limits in terms of the design guidelines. Right now, similar to the vehicle parking code, it's split out into 1,000,001 uses. And so simplifying that down. And we also noticed that the requirements themselves are oftentimes behind or below those of other peer cities. So part of our work here was really looking at other cities around the country that are comparable to Sacramento to see what the best practices are in those areas. And we also realized too that, whereas 10 or 15 years ago, the bicycle was the bicycle, but now it's more than that. We have cargo bikes, we have e-bikes, we have adaptive bikes, we have scooters. And so there's other forms of mobility out there that sometimes cannot be accommodated in a traditional bike rack. And so this is what the actual table looks like in terms of bicycle parking, recommended bicycle parking requirements. So you'll see here, there's a few different columns. Some set of requirements are grouped together from central city and what we call TODs, or transit-oriented developments, and then essentially the rest of the city. And you can see for each of these, the number of spaces that are required either per unit or per 1,000 square feet of development. So if you were to build, let's say, a 10 multi-unit dwelling in the central city, you would have to provide 11 long-term bicycle parking spaces. There's also requirements to determine how many of those spaces would need to be cargo or adaptive, and how many are for e-bikes. And so there's different mechanisms in here to be able to get the type of vehicles that we need. All right. I apologize, I'm working from home. In addition to that, there's also requirements that are built in here to provide certain amenities for offices and industrial uses, like showers and lockers, as you can see. So generally, these are really for larger facilities to be able to provide those sorts of amenities for employees, of large office complexes and things of that sort. In addition to this, we're also recommending that there is a bike rack placement and design standards that would be referenced in the municipal code as well. In those design guidelines, what we're recommending is that there be a more comprehensive list of all the pieces needed for short and long-term bike parking, the best practices in terms of wayfinding and signage to bicycle parking, as well as the accessibility and use of those stations. So for example, and being able to site them and place them properly. So one of the things that we've heard from some stakeholders so far is that, if you're not necessarily, if you're mobility impaired, that maybe trying to access a bicycle that's hanging from a wall is not necessarily feasible. And so really making these sorts of facilities accessible to everybody. And also designing them in such a way that the dimensions of the bike facility can accommodate the various sizes of vehicles. Vehicles being bicycles or e-bikes or whatever the case happens to be. So moving on to the third component, which is the parking management toolkit. So as many of you know right now, I mean, Sacramento already has a pretty robust parking management system in place, and it addresses the needs of many different types of users, from residents to employees to visitors to patrons and so forth. There's a lot of people accessing the parking resources of the city. And most of that management right now currently occurs within the central city, as you would expect. The most density, most uses are occurring in the central city. And so you have more residential permits, you have more parking meters, you have more things of that nature in there. The trick is now that since the city has eliminated minimum parking requirements, which I will note is also what many cities now are across the country are doing. This is not simply a thing that Sacramento does. This is really best practice, and that frankly should have happened a long time ago. But eliminating those minimum parking requirements basically highlights the need for more active parking management, because a developer now can come in and simply provide no off-site parking, or I should say off-street parking, with the understanding or the false understanding that they can somehow park all of their residents, employees, or tenants on street, and that it will become essentially at the city's expense. And so it really behooves the city to take appropriate action when necessary to make sure that any new development doesn't necessarily come at the cost of existing residents or businesses. And so how do we do that? So currently the city already has a residential parking permit program, an RPP. And this program has been in effect for quite some time, but there are some shortcomings to it. First of all, it's basically comes at a high cost for the city because the permits are free. So there is no cost recovery involved. And there's also not really a limit of permits that are associated with it. And this is not unusual. We've seen this happen in other cities, but when this happens, not only does it tend to run a deficit for the city, it also tends to be a license to hunt. So it doesn't actually effectively resolve the issue of prioritizing residential parking, because so many people have permits that you're simply hunting for a space. The idea here is that the RPP program is maintained, but really bring it into best practice with many other similar communities, so that you limit the number of permits per household, maybe to 4, which is still quite a few, and you have prices associated with those. They're all still relatively modest, but there is some sort of tiered structure to it, so that if you want to park 1 car on the street, that could be very cheap. But if you're going to park 4 cars on the street, then perhaps you need to pay appropriately more for it. And that if you are going to park fewer vehicles, that you actually might get some sort of multimodal incentives instead, to encourage you to walk, bike, or take transit. The second piece of this is what they call a supplemental parking permit program. So this is relatively new. It's already going on in the city. It's being applied to a few different developments in the central city. And what this does is actually fully take into account the actual costs and value of these on-street parking spaces for new developments that come in. So new development, multi-unit development, for example, comes into the central city. The developer says, gosh, I want my residents to be able to park on street. These parking spaces come at a very high value. And again, the emphasis is not to allow new development simply to pour onto the street. And so the idea is that they actually established what they call market rates for each of these areas. So conceivably, a developer coming in might provide less parking, and the residents can still purchase a permit on street, but it might cost maybe $260 a month to park on street, which is essentially the market rate. And so this is actually currently being tested right now at a few different locations, and very well could be expanded depending on how it goes. But it would really be probably most best applied, in denser areas. Number 3 has to do with expanding what they call the SAC Park Meter program. So everyone is familiar with the parking meters in Sacramento. They're really mostly contained to the central city right now. And in many cases, that makes sense. Generally, you want to put parking meters in business areas where you do have higher occupancies, and you want to encourage a certain level of turnover and not have employees, for example, parking in those prime parking spaces. As the city develops and you have more development, let's say in some of the older corridors outside the central city, it very well may make sense to have parking meters in those areas. And so only really where they are needed, though. Because again, parking meters are about parking management, not about generating revenue. If they're about generating revenue, then you actually end up with some pretty unfortunate consequences. And so the city actually has a very sophisticated model in terms of how they price and manage their parking. Expanding permit offerings and programs. So there already are some options that the city has, but I think what we were recommending is expanding this to include permits for low-income residents or employees, acknowledging the fact that not, service workers are not the same thing as, lobbyists, for example. And really using them to maximize the use of available publicly managed facilities that have capacity overnight. So being able to park people in those areas where there is availability. Parking enforcement services. One of the comments that we heard particularly from our previous community conversations, was that there's not enough parking enforcement, and that parking enforcement is often performed on a complaint-driven process. And some people even commented that by the time the complaint is lodged, the offender is gone by the time parking enforcement shows up. And so the idea here is that the recommendation, I should say, is to create an audit and see actually, is there sufficient enforcement or not, right? We actually like to be able to not just go on, what some community members say. We like to actually do like an actual statistical analysis. And if there is not a sufficient enforcement currently, which it very well might not be, to be able to finance it appropriately so that it's consistent and not complaint driven. So there is an expectation that the rules should be followed, not just in the central city, but in various parts of the city. And the idea here is not to be punitive at the end of the day. The idea is it's not a gotcha moment. And it very well could start out with warnings and then be tickets. But the idea is that, a lot of these rules that are in place are not currently serving residents and businesses because they're not being followed. The sixth has to do with expanding on-street car share parking. Car share programs tend to come and go, and most recently they've been largely going in much of the US just because it's very difficult to make them pencil out from a financial standpoint. But car share vehicles can serve a critical need especially for those folks who don't have a car, who don't own one. And so being able to identify on-street car share spaces that have access to charging and wayfinding can go a long way in terms of helping the city attract a car share provider and really expand that. And the last recommendation has to do with implementing what they call mobility hubs. So a mobility hub is essentially a place that you have a lot of different modes coming together so you can easily transfer from one to another. So you can easily, for example, get off the light rail and get onto an e-bike to go where you're going, or to get to a shared mobility device. So you can go to it's a carpool, van pool site. Right now, there aren't too many opportunities for this, but we did want to include it in here because the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG, is actually in the process of developing their guidelines. And so our recommendation is relatively simple, so that the city could kind of piggyback on SACOG's recommendation to develop these if and when and as appropriate. And with that, I think we're on to questions and answers.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Brian. That was super informative. Happy that we walked it through. We have some questions that are coming into the chat box. So we're going to field most of the questions out of the chat box first. And so if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box. We're going to kind of start at the top on what we got during the presentation, and we'll work our way through. So again, we have plenty of time. We can sit and answer as many questions as we need. And again, if at the end, if we get through all of the questions in the chat box and no one else wants any chat box, if we have any time to raise our hands, we can chat from there. So Brian, how long has the city had minimum bicycle parking requirements?
Excellent question. So I know the bike requirements as they stand today in terms of both long and short-term bicycle parking requirements have been in effect for 11 or 12 years. Prior to that, I can't actually remember. I think there were bicycle parking requirements, but I think they were a little bit more generic. I don't know, Vic, if you have an institutional memory of that or not, or anyone else from the city.
I do not. Ryan, do you have that information?
I do not know.
So at least over a decade, which is good. And sorry, Donna, it looks like I missed your question at the start. She asked maximums, but do we have minimums?
Right. So
I think we
yeah, that's
covered
why-
that.
Yeah, I did. But I'll say it again. No, there are no minimum parking requirements. Initially, as part of the study, we were looking at them, but partway through the study, the city did pass the general plan in which it eliminated minimum parking requirements citywide. So it's not really mentioned within our study because it's already city policy.
Wonderful. Just, yeah, I wanted to clarify that. Okay, another question. Are the 5-year data being described simply as approved projects or actually built projects?
So these were all, I think Ryan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the vast majority of these projects were actually constructed. There were, I think, a few that were not, but I think they were at least entitled at the time. And so the idea was that we were trying to find out what the actual market demand for provision of parking would be. And as the projects were improved or entitled, they could have been built as that, and they had very likely the financing to do it. But I would have to go back and look at that again.
Yeah, I can jump in there. Ryan Dodge here, City of Sacramento, Associate Planner. We looked at over 3 years, it was 2021 through early April 2024, and it was planning entitlements only. We did avoid 2019 through 2020 because of COVID. Although anecdotally, that did not really affect our planning entitlements, we still saw those coming through. So this is what they're entitled to, especially when it comes to parking minimums. We would have to hold them to those based on their planning entitlement. And if they wanted to, once they came in for a building permit, reduce the parking below whatever the minimum was that we approved at that time, they would have to come back and get permission anyway. And I did not see any evidence of that going on.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right, the next question. What land use categories does hospitals fall into?
Oh, I'm also looking at one here. It says the transit, light rail, not buses question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought you had clarified that in your presentation too. You were talking about when you were talking about light rail, but then you clarified, or you were talking about transit, but you also clarified that there are some buses that are a part of that transit, right?
Correct. Yeah, I believe there are RT lines 1 and 51, if I remember correctly. But yeah, it's mostly light rail.
Excellent. All right. And did you just answer the land use category?
No.
Okay,
So what
I
land
thought
use
so.
category do hospitals fall into? So there is an other category. So generally speaking, there are some land uses that will be developed, but relatively rarely compared to things like retail or office or residential. So something like a hospital would actually then probably require its own custom parking study, which frankly they need to do anyways. And so, and especially because medical facilities like that often will vary significantly in their composition, whether it's a straight hospital, a teaching hospital, medical offices, whatever the case happens to be. So it's intentionally built that way. Most of the standard codes now are built that way because those studies have to occur regardless.
Excellent. Heather had a great question. Is PROWAG or the PROWAG a state or federal program?
This is federal. And so it's a very funny process that they go through. You would think they would just be guidelines and they'd be adopted by one agency and then everything would take effect, but it doesn't work that way. And different federal agencies approve it at different points. And typically when it comes to transportation regulations at the local level, they wait until the Department of Transportation has officially adopted it. As we understand it right now, and you can go online and see these PROWAG guidelines. They are publicly accessible if you want to page through many pages of code. But it's what we've heard is that the Department of Transportation has been looking actually to strengthen the provisions from the original guidelines. We don't know in what way or how, and to be honest, I'm not sure how this, I should actually mention this too, we don't know how this will be affected by the incoming administration. So we'll see what comes of it, but they are anticipated to be adopted at sometime in 2025.
Great. All right. So Kevin, it looks like Kevin's asking, is there a plan for allowing curbside electrical vehicle charging in the central city? He wants to build residential units and was told it might be too hard to request being allowed to include publicly accessible charging electric vehicles in the charging spot on the street.
This is more of a question that's kind of outside the purview of this study. Our EV charging requirements are really intended for off-street new development, and in the same way, we're not really we're not doing a complete streets plan. We're also not kind of getting into the public right of way with EV charging. I don't know if Stacy on parking services, you have any thoughts or comments on this?
So I know that we do have some curbside EV charging within the central city. So we have over by Southside Park and 14th and E, our curbside, it's angled parking, EV charging. And the Department of Public Works is launching a new division, our Mobility Sustainability Division, working with our planning partners to come up with EV strategies moving forward. So it is something that is being looked at, outside of the parking division, of course.
All right. So Brian, could you say a little bit more on the details of the pilot locations of this Up on the Street program?
Yeah, the supplementary permit
Yeah.
program. You know, I could, but I think Stacy would say it much better than I do, because she's actually administering the program.
Yeah, hi everyone. So in February of 2024, we went to City Council to start a supplemental permit parking pilot program. And really what we were trying to do is come up with an innovative way to support the new laws and have alternatives for residents that are coming into these new developments where no parking is being built and where they're outside of existing residential permit parking areas. So ideally, our first choice is we want people not to bring their cars if they don't need to have their cars. We want to support alternative modes of transportation, car share, and for residents that still want to have a vehicle that don't qualify for residential permit parking, it's just another tool that we can offer to them. So that's what the program kind of generally is. As far as locations, we've got a few developments that are part of that pilot program. We have the Bernice Apartments at 3rd and S Street, Township 9. We just added the Mod Apartments at 15th and G. So as developers or property owners are reaching out, expressing interest, we're working with them so that they can participate in the program.
Wonderful. All right. All right. So our next question, which I think might be a little bit outside, but maybe we can help. So Patrick has seen many people living in their cars and then have them sitting on the street for days and they get to park on the long-term parking. This is a big issue that he sees in the city. Is there any, and this might be an issue for Stacy, but questions on how we're addressing those on the city side?
So this is kind of two-part. I'm not sure if this is referring to people with residential parking permits that are using the street for more car storage than parking. We have seen that, and I think that's where a lot of the support for coming up with some reform on a residential permit parking program comes into play. But we do have a 72-hour policy in the city of Sacramento that no vehicle can be on the street for longer than 72 hours without moving. And so that's a code enforcement issue. So the parking division worked really closely with our code enforcement division to tag vehicles that have been on the street for more than 72 hours and try to get them to move their vehicle. So it is something that we are working on.
Excellent. Thank you.
Katie, can I jump in here for
Yes,
one
please,
second?
Brian.
On a thought, it's not really directed towards this question, but it's made me think of it. I mentioned it earlier in the presentation. One of the topics that did come up that we would certainly welcome more feedback on from this group or others who go on Conveo, that we talked about specifically in our working groups, was the use of curbside space throughout the city. You know, historically, since World War II roughly on. Many people assume automatically that curbside space is really for vehicles, for motor vehicles, and not surprising to see why most curbside space is used for vehicles. And what we heard from some folks was that using this public space for essentially vehicle storage, as we were told, can make sense in some cases, but maybe not in all cases. And that really that the curb, depending on where it is in the city, could have a higher and better use for it. So what I mean by that is it could be vehicle parking or storage. It could be bicycle parking storage. It could be outdoor seating, or it could be trees, or it could be any assortment of things. And so if people do have comments on that, feel free to share it here in the chat or go on Conveo, because we'd be happy to add a bit more detail to that as part of our recommendations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So I think our next question is, does the SUP also apply to low income developments or units?
Yeah, so any development project that's decided not to build off-site park or on-site parking, or build enough on-site parking to support the residents' needs, is eligible to participate in the program.
Great. All right. So another great question. What utilization rate are the parking maximums designed to achieve? He doesn't want parking maximums that allow off-street parking to only be 90+% utilized a handful of days a year, while being underutilized most days.
Right. So the parking maximums were really developed with the market demand in mind, rather than the utilization of spaces. So we had and I should have mentioned this earlier too, we had pretty extensive conversations with developers and lenders and financiers as part of this project to really determine how much parking does the private market really want to provide, and how do lenders play a role in that. Because oftentimes what we hear from various developer groups is, oh gosh, I'd really like to provide less parking, but the lender has a formula that they use that requires me to build more. And what we heard from developers and lenders is that it can be very context sensitive, right? And so building residential units or commercial downtown, midtown, obviously has a different characteristic and format to it than something built outside the central city. Two, that they will oftentimes always try to build to whatever they feel the demand is. Now, when we develop these maximums, we tried to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, set them at a level so that of all the developments that were entitled or approved that we saw, only a few of them would actually exceed the maximum that we had. We had one development, I'll give an example, where they produced, I think it was in the central city, and it had almost 3 spaces per unit. So something like that would clearly be well in excess of it and wouldn't be necessarily allowed under the new regulations. Most of the other ones, though, that we had would easily fit under the existing maximums. But in terms of how that parking is utilized, developers clearly think that the parking, I mean, they don't want to build parking unless they think it will be well utilized. I myself, have seen that doesn't always work out. But I do know that costs and return on investment are key for development performance, et cetera. So, I think we're trying to do the best we can with the data that we have. In the future, I think it behooves the city to look into how these maximums are being used and applied in future developments to see if they should be modified at a later date.
Awesome. Great answer, Ryan. Thank you so much. So again, the chat box is open for any questions. And again, we're happy to answer any. We'll still be on this call here for just a little bit. I'm happy to go back through any slides or to dig into any data. But left plenty of time here for question and answers. The other thing is that Felix has put in the chat box a direct link to the Conveo page. And so at that page, that's where we're looking for real-time comments. You can respond to each other's comments, create a conversation on the Conveo page. So again, if anyone has missed this conversation either yesterday or today, have them check out the video that's going to be posted online. We'll have the presentations in PowerPoint online too. But the most important thing is we're going to keep that Conveo page open. I think December 2nd is the date. And so while you're sitting at home looking at that Thanksgiving parade, eating turkey, make sure that you invite your neighbors and friends over and get to that Conveo page and make sure that you're putting the comments in. It's really, we respond to the comments. We change direction of the plan depending on these comments. And so again, it's really, really important that we get as much feedback as possible over the next couple of weeks. And so again, I really want to say thank you for everybody who has came out and supported these meetings and been a part of all of the stakeholder and community conversations so far. But make sure that you're telling your neighbors and friends and coworkers about this Conveo page and that it's going to be open until December 2nd so that we can get our comments. Vic, you want to take us through at least just some of the next steps while we're waiting for any other questions that might come through?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Katie. So I don't know if you want to pull the slide up. You're welcome to if you'd like. Just had a
I
little
don't
bit
know
of
why you're
information.
not seeing his slides, Vic.
Oh,
His
you do have
slides
it
up.
open. Okay.
Yeah,
You know, I might have,
I think
let's
yeah,
see.
this
I
was
think I might
happening
have,
yesterday too.
there we go. I think I just clicked away from his
Oh,
screen
good.
to the tiles. So yeah, just wanted to, as Katie was noting, we're open through the 2nd, but we are, so we've completed a couple of other commissions. We went to the Disabilities Advisory Commission last week, and we'll go to the Active Transportation Commission next week. This is, again, the 2nd of 2 community meetings, and really wanting to get all that input that we can through the Conveo site, but also through the project website. Feel free to submit comments there as well. And we'll package up those comments that we receive through December 2nd, translate that into an evaluation of our current document and any revisions that we think we should make and prepare that final draft report over the course of December. And we'll bring that forward for consideration by the Active Transportation Commission and Planning and Design Commission in early 2025, followed by City Council again early 2025. And then our next steps after that are going to involve, once we have council approval, we'll go ahead and begin the work on implementing the revisions, which would involve a couple of ordinances, which we would bring through the review and adoption process in fall 2025. And then if you'd like to go to the next slide, we can just share the project, our project website and address are here. So if you want to reach out directly by email, parkingrevisions@cityofsacramento.org, the project team will get all those emails. And then for the project website, cityofsacramento.org/parking-revisions. And we have the draft strategy, and then the final draft strategy will be made available there as well, and some supporting background documents and some background on the project process. So encourage you, if you want to get more information, to go there. If you want to share your thoughts by email, reach out. Again, it's always helpful if you are in the Conveo document, because then your comments are really tied to the specific recommendations within the document itself. That really eases our process for making revisions that reflect the input that we've received. So again, with that, really, I don't know if there are any more questions that have come through, Katie, but really want to thank everybody for your time, your consideration. We know that public comment always makes our plans better, and we really encourage you to share any thoughts that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of questions have came in. So someone's asking about the details of the stakeholder group. Brian, I know we have a working group, right, that has brought over stakeholders throughout the central city and Sacramento to chat about this, correct?
Yes, we do. We had 2 different working groups as part of this. And so yeah, I mean, they were comprised, one working group was focused on residential needs, the other was focused on non-residential, just to kind of parse it out that way. I'm not going to get into everyone's names right now specifically, but we can discuss that at a later date. We also did have other individual one-on-one conversations with other stakeholders, like I mentioned earlier, like developers and lenders, to try to understand the parking maximum. So we can document that.
Absolutely. And then Harrison had asked what efforts are being made to inform the public about these changes. And I think, Vic, you just mentioned some of the meetings that you're presenting this at, that we have the Conveo page that's out that we're doing. Again, this is our 2 public meetings. We had one during the day yesterday, one at night time, same format, same information, trying to get to as many people as possible. Is there any other efforts, Vic, do you know of on the city side on the education? I know you guys are going to be promoting this and trying to talk to as many people as possible.
Yeah, and just, we've distributed notice about the community meetings and the public review draft via an email list. So kind of people who've signed up for those email distribution over the course of the project will receive those updates. If you want to get the updates for when that final draft is available, please do sign up. We'll have a couple more emails that go out through the end of the process. And then really, leaning in on our, again, working groups, which were represented a broad range of interests, and then our commissions, which also are really big a range of geographies and neighborhoods and interests into those commissions. So we've leaned it heavily on those as part of our review process.
Great. And just to answer another question, we did advertise these 2 community workshops across the central city over the last 3 weeks. We put over 20 lawn signs out. We had multilingual documents. We've been doing flyers, lawn signs, big email, City Express articles. So we've really tried to hit everybody, both on the digital, in-person, neighborhood associations. We've made hundreds of calls, and so we really hope that we've gotten to some hard to reach communities as well. Do we know when we're planning to go to the Planning Commission for anointment on this?
We are tentatively looking at late January, but certainly in the first couple months of 2025.
Great.
And we'll be at the Planning Commission tonight for just the informational review and comment of our draft strategy. So after this meeting ends, I'll go to the Planning and Design Commission meeting.
All right. Okay.
And I'll end on this too. I just so everyone knows, when we went through and developed the recommendations for this plan, one of the things we really tried to keep in mind throughout were both best practices from other communities and things that have gone horribly wrong in other communities. It's a good thing to learn from people's successes as well as their failures so that we don't repeat them here. And this comes from things like having, specifically, I'll call them out specifically, but Portland, Oregon has been a great guinea pig for Sacramento in many ways, both in terms of, having not manage their on-street parking effectively after the removal of minimums. It kind of highlights the key need of that, to having bicycle parking requirements that are really feasible for developers. They've actually had to change their bicycle parking requirements over time because they were overly prescriptive. And so really the way that we had planned out this document was such that it really kind of tried to take the best elements from different communities and what we know works around the country, but also keeping an eye on things to avoid complications. And so really it's a great plan to move forward. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for participating tonight. And again, keep the comments coming on Conveo. We'd love to be able to see them. Tonight's not the last opportunity, so please go on there.
No, and again, Felix just put everything into the chat box. So again, you can email us, you can visit our website, you can go to the Conveo page. Please, please, please stay in contact with us. And again, if anyone has missed this meeting, we're going to make sure that, again, we're downloading the video right after this meeting. We're going to get it up as soon as possible because we already have people who are asking us for it. And so you should be able to see that on the city page, I'm hoping by early next week, followed by the presentation and the meeting summary. But please, please save some of these links and email addresses, and we would love to hear from you. Great. And so,
Hey, Katie,
yeah.
sorry, I don't think every question has been answered. And plus there was one up at top from Harrison who asked a question about if there's an option to have a verbal comment. And then there's some comments down below.
On what, on where the working group's going to be put in?
The working groups one, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have the working group in the final document. We just we can't give out their personal contact information and names on a public forum here tonight.
No, but the organizations, they're actually listed in a staff report when we went to Planning and Design Commission, I believe, last July. I can try to find a link.
Okay, great.
Follow up with that person. If you can note that, I can follow up with the person and give them the organizations and no personnel and information.
And I actually took a note here too, to list the organizations that we talked to in our report. So one of our revisions that will make the public draft to the final is that's what I meant by documenting it. Sorry, apologies if that was unclear. But what I meant was we're going to change the public review draft to actually note those organizations that we spoke to.
Yes. And if anybody would like to come off of, raise their hand and be verbal, we're happy to take in the comment.
And Harrison, I believe you're still here. If you wanted to comment verbally instead of typing in the chat, you're welcome to.
Oh, let me see. I'm gonna find you, Harrison. I just asked you to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
You can.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting this meeting and giving the opportunity to give some feedback. I've already submitted some of my, or I think all of my thoughts onto the shared document. But I wanted to also echo those comments verbally. So I'll try not to keep this brief, but I'm a renter. I live in a newer building. I live in 19J, which the planning people might be familiar with. Myself and a lot of my fellow residents here had no understanding of why we weren't able to get a residential parking permit. A lot of people don't understand why. For a long time, I understand there's competing interests here, but there wasn't really enforcement of parking. The 2-hour parking. So a lot of people have been parking on the street. And now that enforcement has picked up to, I guess, normal levels again, a lot of people are getting tickets a lot, and they just don't understand why this is all happening. And from my perspective, I really feel like there needs to be more onus on housing providers, landlords, to inform residents when they are in a building that doesn't provide parking and also doesn't, you're in a situation where you're like, oh yeah, you can park on the street, but then you don't understand that you're not actually allowed to park on the street. So I think there's just essentially like I wouldn't necessarily call it a loophole there, but right now, like the building I'm in, they're charging market to above market rent, right? And maybe if people understood that they weren't allowed to park here and they're going to essentially be paying a whole bunch of money in tickets or having to find another parking place, they wouldn't be willing to pay that rent. I really feel like there needs to be more affirmative actions taken to inform people of what they're really getting when they move into a newer building, and maybe even put in serious incentives for people who actually don't have cars to move into such buildings. Because if we're being real here, if you're moving into a new luxury building, which the vast majority of the buildings being built that are benefiting from these lower parking requirements are, the people moving into them, they have cars. They want to be able to get to Tahoe or whatever, do all the fun things that are near Sacramento, but hard to get to without a car. So I don't know if that's within your purview. I assume that takes a lot more political will than whatever you are allowed to do within this commission. But I would really hope that those thoughts could be echoed to the decision makers who could make a difference in that sense.
I'll chime in here for a second. So Harrison, we actually did discuss this very issue as part of our project. And there has been several instances, not just yours, where developers have come in and conveniently omitted the fact that there might not necessarily be plentiful free on-street parking for people to take advantage of. So one of the things that we do need to, I've just made another note of it, that we do need to incorporate in this plan is that to have the recommendation that developers actually sign and acknowledge that they have informed all residents of the parking available or not available to them when they develop the property, so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again, because there definitely seems to be a mismatch of information that's been floating around. And so we want to get ahead of that. So thank you for that comment.
All right, and it looks like we have a question from Donna. Just asked you to unmute yourself.
Yes, hi, and I'll try to be brief as well. So I'm an older resident. I live in an apartment complex at 5th and P. It's an older building. And I would just echo what my what the gentleman just said before about new buildings coming in. So when those new luxury buildings come in, which they have to do the infill here, and they don't have any minimums, and then those folks rightfully need to figure out where to put their cars because they want to go up to Tahoe and do all that sort of stuff. Residents who have lived here forever, who also have a car because we want to go up to Tahoe, we're impacted by that, right? And so it seems to me that part of this might be making sure that those developers, those lenders, all those people that want to deal with market, have them put in extra spaces. There's only so much street parking you can possibly do, and somehow use those for public parking. Let them go down into the dirt and give us some more parking. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
No.
Oh, I
Great-
appreciate
great
that one.
thoughts. Yeah.
Excellent. And it looks like we have Jeffrey now. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I'm on 5th Street also, up here next to the Sac Valley Station. And since they made the one-way street into two-way street, it has affected the residential parking because the building that's got mostly almost 75 units in it, it is only the street that you have the availability of parking. Further considerations of what you're doing now for the future and knowing more when you're changing from one-way to two-way streets, impacts that you're having. Was that in any regard any concern, and what more with the both pedestrian and biking situation? How has that, is that in the adoption change? All I heard basically was parking and for developers in this discussion today. Did I miss some portion about dealing with how you have a biking space and how you have a pedestrian outlook?
So as I try to clarify this early on in the presentation, but what the study is and what it's not. So this presentation is really, or presentation, the study is really about managing the code for future development, about what it should and should not provide for our vehicles and bicycles, and then helping the city refine its parking management across the city. So it's not intended to get into any sort of complete streets or bicycles or pedestrians or things like that. These are other efforts that the city is already tackling. Is not part of this.
Okay.
All right. And Jeffrey just put a good question in the chat. Are the maximum parking policy zones in existing transit areas only, or also planned growth areas like Natomas?
Excellent question. One moment. While I go back to my handy dandy map. If I can get it to go back, that'd be even better. Okay. So we did have a discussion about this, about where to plan this or where not to. And the idea, the way that the code is intended to be written is that these areas can expand over time. So if there are new light rail stations that pop up after, years down the line, the new code will automatically take effect in those areas. We discussed the option about setting up those boundaries now in anticipation of the future development. And the thinking was that the construction, for example, of the Green Line light rail was so uncertain that people didn't want to commit to building and having maximum parking requirements in areas like that kind of preemptively. But these things, the way that they're intended is that, yes, they will kind of naturally expand over time as either light rail or high frequency bus service is extended throughout the city.
All right. And a nice comment into the chat as somebody who rides a bigger bike. It's often hard for her to find bike parking that works for cargo bikes. So she's glad to see if there's some consideration going forward.
Fantastic. We always like to make people happy here. So keep using that
Yes.
cargo bike.
And so again, we still have a few more minutes. So if anyone wants to raise their hand or ask any more questions, feel free to do so. We're happy to answer any that we possibly can within our project scope.
And I do apologize to Jeffrey and other folks here. We would love to work on more stuff, but given our limited scope and budget, we do have to focus on certain things for our study. But yeah, again, it looks like Donna has a question.
Oh, awesome. Let me,
It's a two-part question, if you can hear me.
yeah.
One, what was one of the major learnings from Portland that you've taken into consideration for here in Sacramento? And secondly, can you list some of the other cities that you consider best practices that you're looking from?
Sure. So I'll kind of start with the second one first, but the best practices are actually listed in the report. So you actually can go into the report and there's a lengthy best practices PowerPoint essentially that's listed in there. And so you can see all the cities that we looked at. We tried to look at cities that we felt were comparable. So San Francisco is not in there. New York City is not in there. You know, they do have great things about them, and I will certainly admit to that. But in terms of the built characteristics, they were just felt to be a little too different from here. We did look at Portland, for example, for some positives and negatives. We looked at other places like Minneapolis. Minneapolis is also another city that's kind of comparable in size and transit access and so forth that has done a lot of great things. So definitely feel free, look through all the best practices in there. You know, I'm sure there are more best practices out there too, but you know, again, we have to limit ourselves eventually. The other question had to do with, I can't remember what the other question was. Katie, can you help me out?
Examples from other
Oh, right, the
best
Portland
practices.
examples about what didn't go well. Yes, so in Portland, the two things I was thinking about was Portland, when they years ago, I would say probably about 12 plus years ago, decided to reduce and eliminate minimum parking requirements in certain parts of their city. And there was a pretty rapid growth of multi-unit development in those areas. The problem was they didn't actually pair it very well with on-street management. And so what ended up happening was these new developments came online. Oftentimes parking pricing was unbundled. And not surprisingly, in an effort to find cheap, free parking, people didn't park in their apartment buildings, they would park on street. And the streets became flooded with residential vehicles. And they've since then had to actually reinstate some of the minimum parking requirements and kind of rejigger a bit how they actually address the problem. I think they've definitely learned from it now. They actually have a very robust on-street parking management system, so I don't want to take anything away from Portland. The other has to do with bicycle parking. They had a very well-intentioned bicycle parking requirements that were placed in there. And what they found was that they were so prescriptive that developers were coming back saying, we can't really feasibly build this. It sounds great on paper, but it doesn't really work from a development standpoint. And so they actually had to go back and make the requirements a little less exact. And so we want to be very cautious of these things that we didn't inadvertently cause problems for the city of Sacramento because of really well-intentioned policy.
Excellent. All right. Again, thank you for everybody for their great questions, comments, feedback. We really, really appreciate it. Again, there is now the right links in the chat for the website, the email, the Conveyo page, so that you can continue this conversation after this. But we'll keep this open just for a few more minutes in case anyone has any last questions. And again, thank you all for your participation on a little rainy Thursday night here in Sacramento.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Absolutely appreciate it. And again, use the links. Please go to Conveyo. We love to see written comments. That's the best thing we can get from you.
All right. Well, if that is it, I will say thank you again for everybody for joining us, and we'll shut this community workshop down here in the next about 15-20 seconds.
Give or take. 15 or
You
20.
know, well,
Yeah.
get out of here.
Yeah,
As my dad
exactly.
used to say, I don't know where you're going, but you can't stay here. But, and again, thank you all. Really appreciate it. And to everyone, the video will be on the website. I can't see it not being up there by Monday or Tuesday at the latest, followed by the presentation, the meeting summary. But yeah, we look forward to hearing from you. So with that, we got a thumbs up and I'm gonna shut it down. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Good night.